So good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting us to be here this afternoon. Thank you to all the participants for letting us into your living rooms or into your photographs, as many of you put up photographs rather than anything else. Today, we are going to be talking about communications planning on a pivot. And effectively, what we're looking at, or what we're going to discuss for the next 45 minutes, is talking about how we react to communications as a business post-COVID and during COVID. So we're going to take a look at a few case studies, and we're going to talk about some of the principles in relation to how you can follow the community tone and make sure that the communications campaigns that your businesses are operating are suitable for the times in which we are living in. First of all, I'm going to invite you to connect with Farrell and myself. I'll just ask Farrell to say hello briefly. Or maybe not, but do connect with us on LinkedIn if you already aren't. Thank you for joining us, Farrell. Do feel free to connect with us at LinkedIn or drop us an email if you have any questions. Today's teaser is part of a broader communications training series. And what we'll do today is just talk about some of the issues, but in the deeper training, what we do is we work with our clients, we work with our customers in customizing things specifically for them. So we'll do, for example, an audit of your existing communications and step you through your own issues rather than stepping you through the generic. But let's start off with just looking at the context of COVID. So I'm going to argue that COVID is not a brand crisis per se. COVID, as we have experienced it, has been a systematic shutdown of economies across the world. Now, as we open up again, what happens is there have been changes in the psyche of our consumers, of our prospects, of our stakeholders. And because of that, we have a situation where it's business as unusual. Things are sort of the same, but things are sort of different. And some things have changed. Now, interestingly enough, it's the way in which we react to those changes and the way in which we communicate the changes that is the biggest matter that we, Farrell and I, concern ourselves with. Because it's about looking at your communications, looking at your advertising, your social media, your public relations, and seeing what needs to be different about it to meet the new normal or the business as unusual. We have had over the last 6 months, and in fact, it's scary, it has been just on 6 months since the initial lockdown in Malaysia, but we have had a shared community experience. You know, I'm going to argue I've been in Malaysia for over 15 years. And there's only 2 times I have seen, or maybe 3 times I've seen a shared community experience on this scale. The first one was the Bersih rallies a few years ago. The second one was when PH won the national elections 2 years ago. And the third one was COVID lockdown, where suddenly the sense of community overtook everything else. Now that has a relevance because that provides us with a new set of paradigms in which we have to operate our businesses. From a communications perspective, this provides us with a new set of paradigms and a new tone and a new type of information that our prospects, our customers, our clients, they are going to want to see and experience. Now I'm going to start off, and at the risk of being boring, let's define a communications audit. So a communications audit is the process of identifying internal and external communication strengths and weaknesses. And we'll talk about both briefly today. When the communications audit is complete, a company should be able to understand and evaluate the goals, efficacy, reach, and satisfaction of their current communication strategy and performance. At the end of the day, we're just asking ourselves one real question. Does it still work? If not, change? If it does, fantastic, you rode through it. So let's take a look at what I mean by community tone to start with. If you have a think back to the early days of lockdown, did you feel a change in the way in which you interacted with those around you? I'm not talking about your colleagues. I'm talking about the fact that people met neighbors for the first time in ages. People were checking in on other people. People were generally more concerned and worried and fearful. And as a result, they actually became nicer towards each other. There was a little bit more of a community spirit that came through, and that was something that was really important for us to look at. So community tone for me is about the way in which people outside as a collective are riding through this shared experience, both lockdown and what we are getting now. What we are getting now is a downturn in economic activity, mass unemployment, trouble with supply chains and logistics to get certain products in, an increase in localization of product sourcing and product supply. All of this gives us some sort of suggestion as to how we need to be able to communicate. When it's a time of achievement and growth and happiness and buoyancy, our communication has to be positive and out there and really celebratory. But we have a time where people are suffering a little bit more. Maybe we are not, but those around us could be. And because of that, we've got to look at what are we communicating to them and how we are communicating. So at the moment, we have a little bit of a subdued tone in the community. It's not about all things doom and gloom, but it is, let's be cautious. I'm still a little bit worried. Things are improving, but they're not yet there. So that is what I refer to as community tone specifically. Now, I want to start off with a few things because I'm more interested in where the failures are so that we learn from them. What I did is I put together, actually partway through the lockdown, I put together a set of examples that I got of social media. And this is about brands who simply missed the mark on social media. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't matter whether you're using social media, traditional media, whatever, you've still got to be able to try and get the tone right. Excuse me, not only get the tone right, but get your message right. So it can happen for a number of different ways. This was in April this year. Very simple one. Mahathir gives $20 billion stimulus. Now, I include this because social media is an absolute up-to-date, up-to-the-minute method of communicating. And when you do sponsored, and if you can see here, my office had sponsored this in April 2020. When you do sponsored posts, they are pre-planned. The problem is the information may be out of date. Mahathir had already lost his position through whatever means you want to discuss, but he was no longer Prime Minister. He was actually, in terms of our real world, no longer relevant. So here you've got to look at, it's not only what you're posting today, this minute, it's about what planned commitments have you had? Have you already planned for, maybe with an agency or done yourself? But what planned commitments have you got that needed to be changed? So quite often the challenge becomes not only looking at what I'm doing immediately, but also saying, okay, I had a 3-month campaign, it's partway through, is it still relevant? And in this case, they failed because they were clearly not keeping up with the times simply because they pre-planned everything. You'll all be familiar with this particular influencer, local influencer, and she had a little bit of a backlash simply because of this. During the absolute height of the lockdown, when people could not go out, when we had very limited opportunity to do a lot of things, Here is somebody who has a mass following showcasing that she's using a stapler worth $80 or 80 ringgit. The challenge here is this didn't match the tone. This is a successful individual. She has money. She has a wonderful lifestyle. No issue with that. People follow her because they want or they have aspirational needs to follow her. But at a time when things are really going down and you are concerned for your economic well-being and so forth, the last thing you want to do is to rub people's faces in your success or in the expense that you're spending. So this became a little bit of or created a little bit of a backlash for her amongst other things that were happening, simply because she was pushing something that at the time was deemed to be very unrealistic. Now, there are many more other examples of this, but this is what I mean about reading the tone. When people are subdued, when your community is subdued, concerned about money, don't push items like that. Simply go ahead and deal with community support or other matters. Let's get the next one in here. Okay, this was my favorite from the lockdown period. And this is simply about the fact that, again, you don't read the tone. In the early days of COVID, and even now for some societies, there's an absolute fear about how many people are getting sick and how many people are dying. In the early days of COVID, we knew very little about it, and we knew very little about how many people, or what percentage of people can survive and so forth. So this particular individual posted on a group that I'm part of, social media. What a sad reality. Demand for wills increased 76% in the UK. If you're concerned and want to talk it through, this is opportunistic. The problem is opportunistic attempts at promoting what you do or your product does not gel well with people when there is basically when there is a crisis that continues throughout society. So this was very misplaced. This was almost a hard sell of a negative product in a negative time. That didn't work for a lot of people. This one's another one. Is your business healthy? Click to find out. Nothing wrong with this ad if you are in a time of positive economic growth. But the problem is everything suddenly closed down. People were suffering, businesses were suffering, jobs were lost, or there was considerable uncertainty. And this again was viewed as opportunistic. Plus, from a messaging perspective, I can help you create or strengthen your business opportunities when we have a normal. When we're in a time of absolute uncertainty, this messaging goes out the window, because this guy, no matter how experienced he may be, probably cannot give you the answers that you need to help your business achieve its goals. So again, it missed its mark because the message was something that was relevant for last year. It was not relevant for this year. If this was to come back, say September, October, the goal of the message is right, but the way in which the message is written needs to be recommunicated as well, because it should be about how we can help you pivot rather than figuring out your strengths and weaknesses, which we've all related to and dealt with at the time. This is another one. This one particularly pissed me off. Now, I say it in strong words because we went from a situation where people were working in an office, working in the factory, to an immediate work from home environment with very little structure. We found it maybe amusing. We found it innovative, but we had to learn how to balance the lifestyle. From people walking behind us, to kids screaming, to cats meowing during Zooms, all sorts of things, and balancing our time, to going from a 9 to 5 to an 8 to 10. Because Since we were there and had nothing else to do, people were answering their phones and those boundaries got blurred. But what we have is a company that then comes along and says, right at the beginning of work from home, how do I manage your non-performing employees? And basically, how can I help you terminate people? That's what this business was about. Now, the challenge here is at a time of extreme uncertainty, people see this message and they feel even more threatened by the message. We've had 6 months of work from home. Some theorists are now saying to us, you know what, work from home isn't really that great for us. And there's some really interesting research coming out on that at the moment. Others are saying, hey, work from home is great. Let's continue with it. This message is relevant for tomorrow. It certainly was not relevant for yesterday. It missed the tone significantly. This one, very simple. Until April 14, we're doing takeaways and deliveries as long as the authorities allow us to function. There's my first problem. When you shift the blame, you are actually detracting from your message. The message you want to put through is for your customers, for your prospects. What is your solution to help them with their lives? We don't want to put frameworks on it or parameters on it as long as the authorities allow us to function. That does not sound right. It doesn't buy sympathy. All it simply says is, well, we're opening because we're told we can. But that doesn't sound consumer-centric. That does not sound customer-centric. So the messaging lost me. The second one, and we have dropped our prices by more than 20%, also gave me another perspective on this. So why? I have to ask, why did you drop your prices? Collectively, we may have assumptions on this, but you've now decided that you're undervalued. Again, this sounds, because the authorities allowed, the byproduct of the tone of that message tells me it sounds like you were forced to drop your prices. If it had been written in a more positive way, helping you through this time, our prices have decreased by 20% because we care, is a much more positive message that would have come across and would have endeared the audience to the business a little bit better. Okay, we'll go with this one. Again, it's a very simple thing, and I see businesses still doing this due to the movement control order. Again, we're assigning blame. Today, we call it business as unusual. We call it the next normal, the new normal. But you know what? It is normal for today. We cannot use this as an excuse. So when we refer back, when we remind people, when we remind our customers, our prospects, our stakeholders of the fact that things aren't the way they used to be, we're not helping ourselves. We simply need to be able to move forward as best as we can and not refer to the situations that have happened. This one was actually great. I liked it, except for the fact it reminded us back of the fact that everything is limited. What I loved about this one, because it's both good and bad at the same time, what I loved about this one is it was educational, it was supportive. It told people what the new normal was for them. So the operating hours, how they can get in, what sort of support they've got. All of that was fantastic. The mistake that they made was bringing us back to the movement control order and reminding us that things aren't as they were. Now, if you have a look on Facebook, what number of businesses that you either interact with or see through sponsored posts still make reference to this? Because they make reference to this, it becomes a negative scenario. So let's look at what we should be communicating and why it's important. At the heart of this, stakeholders have to come first. Now, stakeholders are very broad within an industry. It's your staff, we have internal, we have external. It's the prospects, those people who are not yet your customers, but may become your customers into the future. It's people who like suppliers, anybody who has a linkage to your business other than being a customer. So the one thing you want to ask is, what do they want to see and hear? So what do they need? What do they want? What do they not want to have driven down their throats again? Let me ask you the big question. Are we pivoting communications or communicating a pivot? Pivoting communications means we realign what we do to meet the needs of the society or the stakeholders or the community that we have an outreach program with. Or are we communicating a pivot, which is telling them what we are doing differently? In terms of what we have to look at, it is actually both. We are changing the tone and the style and the manner in which we need to be out there. But we're also in helping them to understand what we are doing now to help them along the way. So I'm going to say change is coming. And you might argue, well, Craig, you're talking about the past, you're talking about the lockdowns gone over, and things are going back to normal. But the thing is, change is always there. As they say, change is constant. It's going to be forever there. So what we need to look at is a few simple things. We want to review the context in which we have our communications, both internal and external. This relates to the sensitivity of things and the relevance of things. So let's start with sensitivity. This is about not making people feel bad, feel scared, feel more concerned. This is about looking at what issues are safe to talk about and what issues aren't safe to talk about. So in the last 6 months, we've had so many things on a global scale that have happened that have rechanged sensitivities. We have the Karen movement, we have Black Lives Matter, we have cancel culture. All of this relates back to sensitivity. There are things that people can't handle. Now, one of the scenarios that I see looking globally is as we progress towards next year, and this has happened over a few years, it's not COVID only, but people are less likely to take a joke. And as such, you've got to look at how you are telling a joke through your communications, or how you are playing a joke, and whether that's going to be received by the people you want to receive it. You've got to be able to look at absolutely everything. If we go back to the stapler example, to be honest, most of us would never have considered that being an issue. But when we look at the group that we are communicating to, the fact that those are more likely to be the group that is hit hardest by what has happened in 2020, we have to find ways to play down certain things. We also have to look at the relevance. A lot has changed in the last 6 months. Online shopping has become almost a new norm for a lot of people. Entirely different cohorts of individuals, for example, the older silver-haired generation, has come nicely into the mobile phone generation and has adapted technology differently. So we've got to make sure that what we are communicating, the message itself, has a relevance to the audience that we have today. Do we still need this type of service? Do we still need this type of attitude? All of that has an important factor to play. For a business, we need to invest more in digital events. We're literally going from face-to-face to online in so many things. As a business, we actually have the opportunity to involve ourselves in realistic and achievable and pretty much affordable online or digital events, because this is a way to get back into the viewership and the minds, the recognition of our customers. We need to prioritize our internal communications. So mapping out what our strategic communications plan is, sharing regularly on internal channels, and assessing this daily to be transparent. Internal communications is talking with our teams, talking with our colleagues, making sure that everybody is okay, making sure that everybody is on the same page. You don't want to go into an organization, 3 people give you 5 different answers. And that is happening on a number of cases. The key point out of here is to assess daily to be transparent. And I'm going to argue that this is not only for internal communications. This is for external communications as well. We want to make sure that as things unfold in society, the messaging that we've pre-planned, the messaging that we worked on yesterday is still relevant for today because things do change. Just last week, we went from a scenario where we expected the movement control order to be over and things to be normal. We've gone into a scenario where it's extended 4 months. We've just had the Malaysian Prime Minister suggest that it would be fantastic for every bar and nightclub to shut down. And we've just had the minister who came back from overseas and didn't quarantine support that decision. All of this creates uncertainty, which means as a business, if anything like that impacts upon us, maybe we're a restaurant, maybe we're an entertainment outlet, anything like that, we've got to make sure we're re-communicating and keeping our staff and our other stakeholders, financiers, suppliers, etc., all in the loop so they know what the scenario is. Ultimately, the surprises come from outside, not from inside. We want to reset our media strategy. So in this, it's how do you fit into realigned media priorities? A great scenario that Farrell and I had is we were, just before the lockdown happened, we'd been negotiating with a global technology company to represent them in Malaysia. Fantastic. We'd nutted out what we wanted to do. Our planning was based beautifully on what would have worked in January and February 2020. They signed the contract in March. We started. Lockdown happened. There was an interesting change. Media priorities changed. It became news, COVID, local businesses only. International businesses, nah, we don't want them. Now, it wasn't a complete lockout for us from that perspective, but the priorities changed. Instead of being second on the queue, we became 5th. And we had to work that extra bit harder to try and push ourselves back up that queue on behalf of the client. So in relation to this, you've got to look at how do you and your business fit into the current media priorities. Media houses have shut down over the last 6 months. We've lost magazine titles. We've actually lost newspaper titles. One has gone from print to online only, for example. We have had shrinking print runs for all publications and an increased use of online. All of this changes how we are going to be seen and accessed through advertising, through public relations, or through any other communications initiative. We need to look at the fact that intent matters. Community is more sensitive, so you don't want that hard sell. You're there to be part of the community, to support them in the endeavor, not to just sell them stuff. So you come back to a sense of purpose. That's got to be reflected in the media strategy, because whatever would have worked in January is not going to work in October. And an interesting fact that I dislike, but I agree with, is be prepared to discuss COVID, even if it's outside of your narrative. So my advice usually to clients is you don't actually need to discuss it, but media and stakeholders will ask you, how did COVID impact your business? What are your plans post-COVID? It's now become part of the everyday storytelling. It's much like how when Malaysians meet on the street, the first thing, taking your lunch up. It's a similar thing that you're going to get from the media. How have you reacted? How have you fared? So now it needs to be part of your strategy and part of your narrative, so that you either come across as a success story, or you play the pity card that it was very hard, but we survived. Never a good idea to say that, but it's moving forward. And the final one is to reconsider your paid strategy. So my ask here is, are the channels you were using still getting the numbers? Now, all of this is part of an audit, because at the end of the day, what you are trying to assume, what you're trying to find out is what you had as a strategy, as campaigns, as an approach that worked earlier, that works today. Is that still going to work tomorrow? So when you have paid, let's go back to the sponsored post that I showed of Mahathir offering 30 billion ringgit. It became outdated very fast. So when you're planning for your paid strategy, you need to be able to plan for plan B, plan C, plan D, for all of the opportunities or alternatives that might be there. I'm going to look at internal messaging. Internal team messaging is extremely important for remote working. One of the challenges is not being face-to-face with your team. You actually have a situation where the messaging doesn't get across as frequently and doesn't get across as perhaps concisely. The lack of opportunity to work together in the same physical space means that time taken to undertake a task changes. WhatsApp has interestingly moved from being a secondary communication source, because you were always there with people, and it has now become a primary tool because of work from home, because of lockdowns. Now, what I'm going to say is you need to shift your formal communications. Even if you're a small business like Orchan is with Farrell and I and the ladies that we have on board with us, we need to shift from something that is seen as social, being WhatsApp, to something that is seen as a little bit more task-oriented. So products like Slack, Facebook Workplace, etc. It's trying to keep that balance between what we understand and use as social media to what we understand and use as work-assigned media. So internally, try to remove yourself more from platforms like WhatsApp that are seen as being more relaxed to something that is a little bit more serious or structured in manner, just to make that differentiation. Because the work from home scenario, as I said, we've gone from 9 to 5 to 8 to 10. WhatsApp has helped that. We're always on. So we need to look at the communication happens through a particular platform and we control it through that. I'm going to ask Farrell to talk for a couple of minutes on internal and external.
So I think when it comes to your communications, you have to look at, how do you basically communicate, right? As simple as, for example, what are the platforms that you want to communicate, whether it's with your clients or whether it's with your team members, right? And understanding also the fact that, when you have that work from home sort of arrangement, what will be the best time to actually do it, whether it's with your child, with your team members, understanding whether they have children, whether they have, what will be the right time to actually, have a meeting, have a face-to-face meeting. How do you share, for example, ideas if in our line of work, where sharing of ideas is important when it comes to creating proposals and whatnot. So I guess what you basically need to understand is, what you need to take into consideration would be, the different sort of parameters within your organization, right? Like, for example, as I mentioned, if your clients are basically onto prefer Zoom as opposed to WhatsApp, how do we work around it? If, for example, if your team members are into Slack versus, for example, we use DingTalk, for example. How do you find that sort of balance, right? And I think it's also the fact that how do we actually get the best sort of results, understanding the limitations. So I think that's one of the things that we have to take into consideration when you plan your communications. Great. And I think what we also have to look into is the fact that you also need to make sure that they understand, that this is, well, the new normal, right? And how you basically are working. So understanding how they work, understanding how you work, you also need to be responsive, obviously. How do you make sure that they know when you're available, when you're not available, and understanding how I mentioned what best works for you, understanding your limitations, and vice versa. But I think what's also important is the fun element. I think being apart has this sort of gives the impression that that you don't have that sort of as you call it, the water cooler moment. So I think sometimes it's also good to just touch base and not talk about work, but just to talk about things in general before you go into work, so to speak. And some people would like, I know people who dress up and have fun. They have sort of like fun online competitions? So I guess to each their own. And I think you need to understand or at least create something that would work for you, your team, and also for your clients if you are like a service provider. So again, it's a very, very individual thing that you need to consider before you actually plan your communications.
So let's look at how we go about conducting a communications audit. Now, in the time we've got, I can't go through this in great detail. There's a lot involved, and there's actually a very detailed process that you do. What I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes is talk about the quick communications audit to help us make realistic decisions for today. So generally, we look at 4 questions. Why, from an audience perspective? Why would the audience want what we are communicating to them? How does it help them? How does it add value to their lives or to their decision making? How, from the audience, whoops, I think I just answered that. So how does it add value? How do we communicate to them? What are we talking to them about? So it's really looking at some of these simple questions, but we do that through 4 things. The channels that we are using. We need to analyze whether the channels are meeting the needs. So before I talked about the fact that print newspapers had a decrease in their circulation, for example. So from that perspective, are we getting the value, not only the value for money that we're spending on advertising, because advertising prices did not change, but are we getting the value from the experience or the exposure in comparison to other tools? If we have the 60+ generation who have moved to mobile phones for consumption of information, which happened, maybe that is our better investment. So we have to look and say, are the channels we are using today the most appropriate channels that we should use? Secondly, we look at tone. Have we hit that community tone? And you're probably thinking, Craig, you speak too much about the community tone. But the community tone in a time of crisis is what guides us in terms of how we communicate to the community. So it's really important to understand how people are feeling. You find your prospects and you understand what are the issues that concern them. What are their fears? What is their current financial situation? What has changed with their consumption patterns? All of these things help to shape how you want to reach them. You are fighting for their dollar even harder than previously. You're also fighting harder for their attention because we are now bombarded with more social media than previously. We are sitting at home more often than our office. We are going out less than we did before, which gives us more time on these devices. Because of that, we have to fight harder to hit the tone right. We have to fight harder to get the content right that tells them something. We need to go into the story doing type of thing. This is not about, I have a product, please buy it. This is, I have a product that really gels with my life. And you've got to showcase that as a solution, you have something that is going to add value to their life in this period, not in a normal period. And finally, you want to look at what is your strategy. And most of us, when we create a communications plan for an organization, for a brand, we have a very long-term strategy. The problem is with COVID, with what's happened globally this year, is our strategy has had to take a back step because we cannot guarantee that tomorrow will be a continuation of today. Things change. So it's about having more alternatives. It's about using micro strategies for the next few months until we see more consistency in what's happening in the marketplace. And that for us means we have to be ready to change. We have to be ready to trial. And it is a trial because we can't guarantee we're getting it right. But we have to be ready to trial new messages and new messaging strategies. So the usual way to conduct an audit is we'd spend a lot of time on interviews and surveys. We'd review documents. We'd look at statistics. So this can be online and offline statistics. We'd do some research. We'd assess technology. This can take months. You know, we have done communications audits with clients, and it's not something you do overnight. But the problem is we work in a time where everything is changing, so we do have to do it overnight. So let's look at how we do this under pressure. First, we focus on social listening. As a lot of things have turned to social media, let's use social media listening tools to give us a better gauge on what is being said. So there are platforms like TalkWalker, for example, that you can use for free, that you plug in your brand, and it will give you updates as to what's being said out there about your brand. You can analyze what happens on your social media feedback. You know, what type of likes are you getting? How has that changed over the last little while? Social listening is the fastest and easiest way to gauge on what's happening. And when you start to see a negative tonality from the feedback you're getting, so it may be as simple as lots of thumbs down on Facebook, for example, or angry faces on Facebook. That will tell you you haven't hit it right, or your message has been misconstrued, misunderstood, or simply your message was wrong in the first place. Take it down, change it. Use your intuition. This is a time where intuition is going to step up to the plate. What we do is when we put up things through our own social media and we write things for our clients, we spend a little bit more time getting a few of our teams to come together, well, not come together, but to come and look at this and say, well, what do they perceive it as being? Because we want to make sure it's spot on. But because the time is short, we've got to go on gut feeling rather than spending a few days on a focus group or sending out questionnaires. We simply have to work on experience and intuition. So that's where we use team focus groups. Get 3 or 4 people together, look at it, see if you can find holes in the message that you've got. See if you can see a way that a Karen, and I'll use that term quite liberally here, but see if you can find a way in which a Karen could find a reason to be offended. Because that's the start of cancel culture, and that's where your brand is going to be hit from it. And remember that it's going to be reactive, but remember to be reactive. If you see that it could be a problem, take it down. If it's part of a longer sponsored scenario that maybe you've organized through somebody else, connect, get them to take it down, get them to realign it, because it will do damage for your brand. Now more than ever, we need to go through content calendars. Now, content calendar is simply just a plan of the type of content you want to use. when you have a content calendar created, you can compare it to what you see other successful businesses doing. Maybe you want to emulate what they're doing. Maybe you want to be different, but look at the content calendar and have a sort of a loose strategy that can be adjusted to it. Make sure your tone is parallel, the style is parallel, the message is parallel. Don't make it look like it's changing all the time. But because it's changing, make sure that you keep the same tone. You have a brand DNA, you have a brand voice. Follow that. For me, a content calendar is about seeing the whole picture, but then I examine it both as the whole, being the strategy for the next few months, and also as the individual parts. Does this particular post, does this particular activity, does this particular outreach actually have relevance in what I'm doing? So that's coming to the end for us. We'll take Q&A in a couple of minutes. Again, please do connect. In terms of what I said before, this is really just, I guess, a teaser to talk about some of the issues. In a full module, what we'll do is we'll practically work with you. We'll do hands-on in relation to what your brand does specifically. And we'll cover things like reading your community tone correctly. So we'll workshop how you can read that tone. We'll cover how to audit our messaging for social and community. So we'll actually use your brand examples and go through and do an audit rather than just talk about how it should be done. We'll look at how to react to social listening and how do you bring social listening in not only as a good idea, but how do I work with social listening every single day to make sure that my brand is going to be presented the best way possible. We'll evaluate we'll be working on how to evaluate the effectiveness of outreach, how to embrace new platforms, because we are changing on a day-to-day basis. The media landscape is both shrinking and growing at the same time, but that's different aspects of it. We'll look at pivoting your message to align with new audiences. So how do you incorporate, for example, the silver segment into your social media plans, given that you haven't really interacted with them through social previously, because they may not have been a major segment, but you may have interacted with them through print media. And then we'll look at how to take advantage of social media intimacy for stakeholder outreach. So it's really honing down and having those opportunities. So thanks for listening. Farrell and I are happy to take questions, and I think Winnie's going to coordinate that for us.